Craig Melvin. Can I say that again? Craig Melvin. Thank you for saying yes and trusting me with this conversation. Long or short, man, I've been meaning to try to get you on this podcast. I think your narrative is super important. I think you share a lot of other people's narratives. So I want to give you the platform for about the next 30 minutes to share with us a little bit more about yourself. Everybody listening right now, thanks for tuning in. If you're here for the first time, thanks for being here. You could have chose millions of other podcasts out there and you chose the Men of the Hour, probably specifically because Craig is on this episode. He launched a book and it's called Pops: Learning to be a Son and a Father. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. He's also an anchor at the Today Show, and he hosts the Third Hour, and he's all over our screens through NBC as well. But we're going to dive a little deep, my friend, and I want to start with this idea of reaching for the stars. And I think a lot of people look at you and they can imagine what the trajectory of your career has looked like over the years. And for every journalist in the business, I'm sure you can attest to this too. It's always going to be a different journey for everybody. But in your experience alone, Craig, can you tell us a little bit about how reaching for the stars was always maybe a big goal for you, and getting to the Today Show, I'm sure, was an even bigger goal. But now that you're there, I want you to reflect back a little bit with us, if you don't mind.
Oh, that's a big question, Jay. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Yeah, man.
It's an honor, especially since you're a colleague. So, it's funny because people sometimes now will talk about a meteoric rise, or they'll say something that gives me the impression that they aren't familiar with how real the struggle for me was. Especially early on in my career. I saw a commercial in high school. They were looking for a reporter. It's called Our Generation. And the NBC affiliate there in Columbia, South Carolina, which also happens to be my hometown, they were casting a wide net for these 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds who would go down to the local TV station, work with a producer, and generate stories for the evening newscast that were of particular interest to young people. This was the station's attempt back in the 90s to try and get, young people to watch the news. So I went down to the mall and I auditioned. And clearly there wasn't a great deal of other folks who auditioned because I got picked. And I walked into the newsroom the first time, and I knew fairly quickly that it was something that I would want to do professionally. I got lucky. Most people who are 16 or 17 don't find what they want to do with the rest of their lives that early. But everything about the newsroom, the pace of it, the wide range of content. I mean, just, I didn't have to do the same thing every day. And so I started in high school, and then I went to college in South Carolina, small liberal arts college, studied government. And then I started working 2 weeks after I graduated at the same local TV station where I had worked in high school. And I got to work alongside all the folks that I'd watched growing up. Now, that's the romantic version of the story. What doesn't get talked about a lot is how, I graduated from college, and in my first job, I made less than tuition at college, less than tuition at the college where I attended, Wofford. I made so little money that I had to live with my parents for 6 months. And even when I moved out, I moved into my grandmother's house. She passed away, and my parents were renting that to me and a friend of mine. And I used air quotes because we didn't pay rent every month. I was basically living for free for a while because I couldn't afford rent and food and gas.
Sure.
So it was hard. And I started out as a photographer. I shot video. I wanted to be a reporter, but I had not studied journalism. I'd studied government. So I had to prove to my bosses at the time that I could do it. And fortunately for me, I was able to prove to them eventually that I was capable of it. But I spent a lot of my early career, especially, I spent a lot of days working 12, 16 hours, doing a lot of grunt work, taking a lot of the assignments that no one else wanted, working the weekends, working the holidays, and never complaining about it. Because even back then, I knew how I wanted to spend my professional life, and I believed in my heart of hearts that if I paid my dues, as they like to say, if I did that, it would pay off.
Certainly has, Mr. Today Show. You know what?
It depends on the day,
You
Jeff.
said
Some days I'm not so sure it's paying off.
I wonder though. I mean, you said that was the sexy version, and I don't know if this is because I'm similar. I think that when you find something early on, you latch onto it, and you don't start looking at it as a job anymore. This is a lifestyle that you do. I've always had respect for journalists in that regard because I was trying to go local. Then I said, no, screw that. I want to go to New York City. I'll just figure it out when I get there. But you know that is a lifestyle for reporters and now anchors and host talent. But you mentioned something too, which is that at a 15 or 16-year-old age, most people aren't thinking about those things, right? They just want to go to high school. Maybe they'll play powder puff football, run for student government, play tennis, and try to get to college. You already had that vision, right? And there's a lot of visionary activity, I'm sure, that people don't try to think about in high school, and then turn all that into reality. But it's what got you through the grunt work, like you'd said, and it could be the 16, 20-hour days sometimes and doing all the stuff that nobody else wants to do. But in my opinion, that's what makes the job sexy. Not to counter you or play devil's advocate, but imagine a world where, because your job is your lifestyle, you almost have to switch the lens on that. This show is grounded on that. Everybody who's been on right before you, any 50, I think 52 other people, men, like, you could imagine that there's so much gratification, and you should be grateful that you're having to pick up the grunt work, as I'm sure you've always been grateful. But as you were trucking along, I mean, you look back from like 15 or 16, even today, I know that you're the guy that will make sure that even if you had to scrub a toilet in the Today Show studio, you would probably do that. But why are you wired that way, would you say?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. And because I can tell you, having interviewed thousands of folks over the years, it's I used to think it was I used to think it was nurture,
Mm,
and then I came to believe maybe it was nature, and now I think maybe it's a little bit of both. And I think my opinions changed because I have two small children, and when you're rearing children, it's you have two kids that grow up in the same household, same parent,
mhm,
and they could not be wired more differently. I think you're just born certain ways, and I think I was probably just born um, a certain way. That being
mhm,
said, my mother, at an early age, just to give some background on her, she was first in the family to go to college, first in the family to get an advanced degree as well. She got a graduate degree some years later, but she was the oldest of four. Didn't grow up in the best of circumstances, had to help rear her three younger siblings. She was a giver.
mm,
She learned all about sacrifice at an early age. She was practically a teenage mother. I mean, I was born in '79. My mother and father got married in '82. She was in her very early 20s when she got pregnant with me. Here she was, having come off, the better part of 5 years helping take care of her younger siblings. Now all of a sudden she's got a newborn that she's taking care of, and I think at an early age there were expectations placed on me by my mother. I did not have. Uh, I didn't have the option of being mediocre. I didn't have the option to be a screw up. There was and my younger brother and I joke about it now, but you mentioned high school and me doing the teen reporting thing. I didn't play high school athletics.
mm,
I didn't. I was on the Model United Nations and debate team. I competed in oratorical contests, student government. I did all that geeky stuff, key club. My mother, it's we didn't go out on the weekends.
sure.
I grew up um, under a pretty harsh regime,
Mm,
but it worked. I mean, I just didn't have a lot of the freedoms that my friends had because my mother, she kept us on a very tight leash.
sure.
And for a while, she was playing the role of mom and dad. So, I
Mm,
think part of that, and some of it, after years of therapy, I've deduced that some of it was my mother trying to perhaps live a bit vicariously through her children, in a good way, not a bad way,
Hmm.
uh, but it, I mean, the jury's still out. But I think some would say that it's gone okay so far. Her approach.
Hmm. And I think a lot of it ties back to experiences too, and something I wanted to talk to you about today. I'm glad we like kind of stepped into it naturally. But imagine like a life where you're kind of mundanely going through, what your parents have always wanted for you. In Asian culture, I'm half Japanese. It is always the case. Korean,
Mm,
Chinese, Japanese culture, like you're set to be something that your parents kind of want you to be. And if you don't, like my mom, she wanted to marry an American pilot, clear as day that she was going to go be Americanized and she was proud to do so. But her family was immediately ready to disown her. And you could imagine like a lot of people are struggling through that today. Anybody listening, I think you can imagine a life where it's like you want picture perfect and you want the best family. And sometimes like you just don't get that. Your parents may separate you. You may grow up with one parent. You may grow up with no parents. You may be
sure.
adopted. But those experiences almost in my idea sometimes, and I'm a bit too optimistic, but it's almost like a beautiful trauma. And what I mean by that is that you go through these things in life and your perspective, and again back to that lens cap idea, you choose what filter you're putting on these experiences. But if you can kind of give us, and then I want to get to your book. I mean, you mentioned your mom, and
Yeah.
listen, to be a son and a father, I think is when you could tie the knot between those two. I want to talk about pops, but when you can think of one experience where you may had to have told yourself, this is actually the lens I need to put on. This is the perspective I need to have so that it doesn't traumatize me in a negative way. Can you give us one of those, even recently or back then?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think when I was younger, so the premise of the book is the a look at the dynamic between me and my dad. And when I was younger, when it became glaringly obvious that my dad was an alcoholic and he had some addiction issues. Um, and again, it's important to note, I mean, I was a teenager at the time. So the lens through which I viewed that was, oh, dad's weak. He's
Mm,
lazy. He lacks the discipline required to get this monkey off his back. And that was unfair. But the way that society viewed addiction in the 90s versus the way we view it now, we have become far more progressive in that regard,
mm,
or more enlightened, if you will, with viewing it as a disease, as a sickness. I could have, I guess, back then viewed it through a different lens, but I didn't. Now, of course, I view it through a different lens, and I think that's a
mm,
sign of growth. I would contend being able to look at um, the same situation through different lenses as you get older and being able to appreciate different perspectives. I also think it makes for a good journalist, being able
mm,
to look at a set of circumstances and see, two, three, four different perspectives. I could see how now granted there's certain things that universally I think we should all be able to agree they're ridiculous or they're stupid.
yeah.
But more often than not, I tell people all the time, people are like, oh, what makes a good journalist? And I'll say, well, I think being able to cover something not just apparently objective,
Mm,
but truly objectively, like being able to look at something that's happened and
mm,
hear this opinion and hear this opinion and then observe the facts, and being able to look at it and say, okay, well, let's see how that makes sense, or that
mm.
makes sense, or maybe none of it makes sense.
Maybe none of it makes sense. I'm gonna title your episode that, Craig. Maybe
True.
none of it makes sense. That's true. I was gonna ask you too how you measure growth, and you just answered it, which is clearly, I mean, you kind of like you hit the nail on the head when you go through things in life and you can kind of just realize that your thought process or your mindset on something is just way different now than it was then. That's growth, and I think as you're going through your journalistic career, it's been incredibly admirable to see, at least from my lens, right? When I'm watching you interview people, the genuine level of curiosity and objectiveness you have. Now, I know a lot of people might want to know this too, which is why I got to ask you. But as a journalist, someone who's constantly interviewing other people and sharing their narrative, how do you go home after you take the suit off and kind of like live your personal life in a way that you can still keep that journalistic mentality of like curiosity and genuine care for people, which I know is it comes very well through the work that you do. But how does that play into your personal life in a good way?
I'll tell you, my kids are going to grow up loathing dinner conversations because even now they're 7 and 4, and I spend the better part of our meals, or if we're driving in the car, I'm peppering them with questions
Mm,
for two reasons. First of all, I miss a lot of what goes on during the day because I'm working and they're at school or now at camp. So I genuinely am interested in the TikTok of the day, as I call it,
yeah.
what they've been doing, what they've been up to. But more than that, I'm interested in how they feel and
Mm,
how they view the world, how they view their friends, how they view, quite frankly, how they view their parents. I want them to talk. Um,
mm,
I
mm,
read, I read a book before I became a dad about the importance of conversations with your children.
sure.
And if you can just get them talking and you just keep them talking, when they're younger, that helps to establish a dynamic that as they get older and they become teenagers who are loath to talk to their parents,
Mm,
you've got a better shot than a lot of parents do at having them confide in you and trust you, and so the engagement is so that
mhm.
that professional curiosity that I've always had, that I sort of, I think I was probably born with it to a certain extent,
Yep.
but my mother really cultivated that in
Mm.
us, and I'm trying to do the same thing with my children, and I can already tell some days that my 4-year-old daughter is annoyed by my approach, but that's fine. She doesn't really have a choice because she lives in my house and eats my food and wears my clothes, so there's that.
That's it. And until you tell her to pay rent like your mama did, right? No, I'm kidding. She, I'm sure you
Sure.
won't tear up in that
No,
way,
that's
but
a good point because I didn't pay, so that wouldn't be the best example, would it? Yeah.
no, Craig, I think that's very true. And when I think back to like anybody who grows up with their parents, and if you just continue to have open and honest conversation, you're also going to get away from any uh, rebellious stage. I mean, everybody goes through rebellious stages in general, and you're probably going to see it with your kids in their teenage years. But I feel like you can avoid a lot of that stuff if you just stay open and transparent with your parents, right? And build somewhat of a naturally loving relationship, which is huge. So, how about experiences from other people, though? So, I mean, we talked about how this affects you personally, but as you continue to interview the top celebrities, top newsmakers, top athletes, your average person who's just making a huge impact in the world, anybody at a local level that's just doing really great things for their community. As you're genuinely curious and asking a lot of these questions and getting them airtime, for instance, or even if it's a small hit on the website, right? I think everybody's story deserves to be heard. And that's, again, I think the nature of the business and media. If you can do that, that's remarkable. And you've done that. But through journalism and conversation, how do you feel like you're constantly learning from other people in a beneficial way? And the reason I ask you this, Craig, is because I feel like a lot of people today, and I say a lot loosely, I'm not sure how many people actually experience this, are still neglecting genuine conversation and active listening, and you're totally an expert at that. So I just want to know how that plays into your life.
Well, you're kind. That's very kind of you to say, and so thank you. No, I think to your point, and I don't know. I mean, I think social media, quite frankly, is responsible for a lot of it.
Mm,
Um, I grew up during a time, this is before the internet, believe it or not, and people watched and read things
hmm.
to learn about the world, to learn about their community, to learn about their state, to learn about society, to get exposed to new ideas, to be transported to places that they had never been and couldn't afford to go. That's why we watched and read things. And now I think a lot of folks watch and read to have their worldview confirmed.
Mm,
They want to know that there are like-minded people who agree with their opinions on politics and religion and race, and it's people aren't genuine. A lot of people aren't genuinely interested
mm,
in learning or being exposed to new things. Their minds are made up, and so they read and watch or they scroll to just nod their head in agreement. Yeah, I knew it. Yeah, I knew it.
yeah,
And that's unfortunate.
it
But
doesn't do it enough justice.
more than unfortunate, I would contend it's dangerous.
Mm,
Uh, when we start to pretend that opinions are facts and we act accordingly. That's dangerous. You've got to have a baseline of fact.
And a lot of that can come from just talking to somebody. I mean, I was in an Uber car yesterday, and you learn a lot from Jordan, the country, or Georgia rather, and just by asking questions and creating an open dialogue that makes someone feel comfortable. And I think that's again our jobs, but at the same time, something that everybody can do. Can you give us an example recently where you've bumped into maybe a stranger and and kind of just open the dialogue as if like you weren't Craig Melvin and they weren't a stranger? Maybe reverse the roles, for instance, and just you. I feel like you do that often, and it might have happened with us over the years at NBC. But I feel like, have you had an experience recently where just a natural conversation allowed you to learn something from somebody else that was like a total stranger?
I feel like this morning I had a conversation with somebody in the studio. It was John, our Steadicam operator. We got to talking about we had done a story on RVs, and John proceeded to tell me about his RV that he purchased in 2016 so he could drive his two kids cross country and his wife. And they've gone cross country a couple of times, and how it was a worthwhile investment, which got us talking about your family and spending time with
Mm,
the kids when they're younger. I tell people all the time. I think one of the things that served me well is I have always been comfortable enough in my own skin to have conversations with strangers. And I don't know if we're living in a time where a lot of folks are still comfortable having substantive conversations with people that they don't know.
mm,
But it's, and I don't think it's because I'm a journalist. I think it was probably long before I became a journalist. You could argue perhaps it's why I became a journalist. I think that, and you'll find this to be true. I think if you start talking to people, most people have stories that are just remarkable in myriad ways, and you start to talk to people, and you find out that there are very few people who are what you think they are. Very few. It's I tell people sometimes that one of my apprehensions sometimes when folks will come up to you on the street or they'll say, "Oh, you're the
mm.
guy from the Today Show." I always feel like, well, yes, I am. That's true. Thanks for watching. But I'm never like they think I'm going to be. Like it's never,
Sure.
does that make sense? It's just because there are these constructs that we have, we make in our minds, and we determine that this person is like this or this person is like that. And then you spend some time talking to that person and you discover there's so much more than that. Or in some cases, there's so much less than that.
Yeah, that's true. I had a feeling you'd throw that one in there too. Craig, our time's coming to a great close here, and they always say time flies when you're having fun. But I think your narrative was plenty of that. Not just fun, but you've allowed us to kind of tune into your voice for this entire 30 minutes and better understand a lot. And I'm glad we went off on the note about just, I think you have to give yourself the autonomy and the grace to just say hello to somebody, make a smile, and if that's what you guys get out of this podcast episode listening in right now, I think that's such a beautiful thing to be able to do, confident or not, extrovert, introvert, ambivert, whatever you want to label yourself as socially. But at the end of the day, I think it's wouldn't you say, Craig? It's totally okay to even give someone 30 seconds of a hello and a smile, and then that could lead to more, it could not, but it's worth a shot.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Amen to that.
Craig, I'm so happy you published this book, Pops, Learning to Be a Son and Father. So the last question I have for you, my friend, if you had to give one piece of, I would say advice, but gosh, I don't think I've ever asked that on this podcast. It's too loaded. Would you look at a son and father today, and what would you tell them if you saw them in person, knowing that your book is published now, kind of with the incentive that they would hopefully buy the book, but without pitching it to them, what would you want to tell them about the book?
Who am I telling this to?
A son or a father?
Oh, son or father. Well, I would. I mean, with regards to the book, it's a. I mean, it's obviously a story about my father and our dynamic, as complicated as it was. It's a story of addiction, but it's also the story of family and love and resiliency and overcoming obstacles and uh, beating back demons. It's the story of not giving up on someone that you truly love, someone that you care about. So it's not heavy. In fact, I would contend that a good chunk of the story is pretty funny. But there's a lot that folks can relate to in there. So
Craig, Melvin, thank you. Thank you for your time and trusting me with this conversation, my friend. If you're listening now, subscribe, rate, review, do whatever you want to do to come back. Or if you don't come back, thanks for tuning to this episode. I hope Craig inspired you at the very least. So thanks again, my friend.
Justin, be well. Keep going. 52 guests. My God, I had no idea you'd been on the air so long.